Bon, merci tout le monde d'être présent. Ça me fait plaisir d'avoir aujourd'hui Gilles Fischer comme conférencier à l'IBIS. Gilles n'est jamais venu au Québec, donc ça aurait été une belle occasion de le recevoir à Québec, mais je lui ai dit qu'on l'inviterait quand les choses retourneraient à des conditions plus normales. Donc, Gilles est directeur de recherche du CNRS à Sorbonne Université à Paris. Et il fait des travaux principalement en bioinformatique. Et il utilise comme modèle les levures du genre Saccharomyces qu'on étudie aussi dans notre groupe, par exemple. Et il a fait sa formation, une partie de sa formation sur les levures comme stagiaire postdoctoral avec Ed Lewis. Pour ceux qui connaissent la génomique de levure, je pense qu'Ed Lewis, c'est probablement un des premiers qui a étudié l'évolution des génomes de levure peu après le moment où le génome de Saccharomyces cerevisiae a été séquencé. Puis avant son postdoctorat, il a fait un doctorat sur Streptomyces. Je pensais que tu avais fait ton doctorat sur les levures aussi, mais non, apparemment.
Non.
C'est une histoire qui précède l'histoire des levures. Donc, Gilles a fait beaucoup de travaux hyper importants dans notre domaine de recherche. En fait, parmi ses papiers, j'imagine que c'est ses papiers de postdoctorat qu'il a publié avec Ed Lewis. Il y a des travaux qui portent sur les réarrangements chromosomiques, par exemple, chez les levures, puis le lien entre les réarrangements chromosomiques, puis la formation des espèces, l'isolement reproducteur. Donc, un papier, par exemple, moi qui m'avait marqué quand je commençais à étudier l'évolution des levures, un papier publié en 2000, ça fait 20 ans déjà, où il faisait de la génomique comparative avant même que ce soit facile, entre guillemets, comme on fait maintenant. Et il a commencé à étudier déjà là, il y a une vingtaine d'années, l'évolution de l'ordre des gènes, les réarrangements chromosomiques, comment ça pouvait mener à des événements de recombinaison. Aussi, le rôle des éléments transposables dans les réarrangements chromosomiques. Et depuis ce temps-là, il a vraiment été un des leaders dans le domaine au monde sur la génomique comparative des levures. Puis il y a un groupe vraiment solide en France d'évolution du génome des levures, puis Gilles fait partie de ces chercheurs-là qui sont des leaders dans le domaine. Donc, j'ai invité aujourd'hui à nous parler de ces travaux, particulièrement de la variation structurelle dans les génomes de levures. Donc, merci encore, Gilles, d'être là, puis on se reverra dans un an ou deux quand on pourra t'inviter à Québec. Donc, je te laisse la parole.
Merci Christian pour l'introduction. Effectivement, j'aurais bien aimé, vraiment, j'aurais beaucoup aimé pouvoir être vers vous à Québec. Je ne suis jamais venu à Québec, j'avais très envie de venir, mais malheureusement, la situation fait que ce n'est pas possible. Donc, je vais passer en anglais. I would like to, if you don't mind, if you have questions during the talk, I would prefer if you interrupt me because I'm talking to my computer, so it's always better if I can have a few interactions with you. If you feel shy, it's not a problem. You can ask your question at the end if you prefer, but please don't feel shy and interrupt me whenever you want. I'm going to share my screen. Right. Where is my presentation? Here we go. Too many things open, sorry. Okay. I guess you can see my screen now.
Oui, c'est parfait.
Okay. So my talk is the study of structural variation to the genetic and phenotypic diversity in Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So I'll start with a brief introduction about genome evolution. So if you're interested by genome evolution, I think it's good to look at this problem at different scales, at the individual, population, and interspecific levels. The reason for this is because mutations occur at the individual level in individual genomes. And there are two types of mutations: point mutations, where you change one base by another one, or you can add or delete one or a few number of bases. And there's a second type of mutation, large-scale mutations, that comprise a much larger DNA segments. These large-scale mutations, they are more difficult to study, and this is what we call also chromosomal rearrangements or structural variations. So there's a bit of a lack of semantic definition here, but I will try to give more better definition. So these mutations, they occur in individual genomes, and then if they are not purged out by selection or by drift, then they might rise in frequency in the population, and they would generate polymorphism within a population. So, for instance, some people would have a C disposition, some other people would have a T. Same for structural variations. So structural variations are the polymorphisms at the population level that are produced by large-scale mutations. And then these polymorphisms, they can reach fixation, means that now all individuals, they would have the same base at disposition or the same chromosomal organization. And these become, this is now what is differentiating species. And so we use substitution usually to make phylogenetic reconstructions, and these are based on mutations that occur in individuals that rise in frequency and that reach fixation between population, meaning that all chimpanzee would have a T at one position and all human would have an A. And it's the same for chromosomal rearrangements. For instance, in human, all individuals have a single chromosome 2, but all chimpanzees have 2 chromosomes that correspond to the human chromosome 2. And now we know that this has occurred through a fusion of chromosomes specific to the human lineage a few million years ago. And all monkeys actually have 2 chromosomes that correspond to the chromosome, the human chromosome 2. And this all comes from large-scale mutation that occur once in one individual. Okay, that's a general introduction. We can translate the same concept to yeast, of course. We don't have individuals per se, but what we could do, we could have clonal cultures in the lab. So we start with one cell and then they divide and they can generate very large populations actually. We can also mate haploids to generate diploids and look at the segregation of character during meiosis. At the population level, if we are interested in Saccharomyces cerevisiae, for instance, we can sample different strains from different environments. Some are wild environment, like the bark of trees. Some are domesticated environment, like wine or yeast strains, or beer strains, or bread strains. We can also find yeast in insects. And so at the population level, we have a very good view of the polymorphisms in terms of single nucleotide variants, of single nucleotide polymorphisms, because we have more than 2,700 genomes that were sequenced by Illumina technology, so short read sequencing. You can see here that the vision we have of structural variation is much more limited because we only have 24 complete genomes, and it's very difficult to call with a good confidence structural variation on Illumina genome. So this is a bit of a problem here. I think we're lacking a lot of the genetic diversity in Cerevisiae due to the lack of complete genomes. And at the interspecific level, there are, I think, a bit more than 1,000 species that have been described, yeast species, different yeast species. We have the genome sequence for more than 300 of them, and I think there's a project led by Antonis Roccas and Chris Hittinger to sequence all of them. And we also have contributed to understand the evolutionary history of chromosomes by making some reconstruction based on the order of the genes along the chromosomes. Okay. Today, So everything we do in the lab, we actually do a lot of bioinformatics, but we also do a lot of experiments in the lab. And so everything we do fits in one or several of these cases. And today I will concentrate on this particular aspect, like the polymorphism, the structural variation that generate genetic polymorphism in Cerevisiae. And I will also give you some results we had by doing experiments to try to understand how these polymorphisms are generated through the accumulation of large-scale mutation in clonal populations. So there are three stories here. The first one is about generating what we call a reference assembly panel. The second one is try to understand the phenotypic impact of structural variations through CRISPR-Cas9 genome engineering. And the third one is trying to understand at which rate these rearrangements accumulate in genomes. So there are many people who contributed to these stories, but I put here the main players. So Sam is a PhD student in the lab. He was really the one who led the assembly of the panel. Aubin did all the work on the CRISPR-Cas9 genome engineering. Nicolas, Stéphane, and Alexandre are working on this question. Let's start with the first one. Okay, so in population genomics, there are several limitations at the moment. And one of them is that everything is based on a single reference genome. For instance, in human, we know that the human reference genome has been assembled mainly with the DNA of one single American white male. And it's hard to believe that this genome can represent the entire genetic diversity of the human population, of course. And it's the same in yeast. We have the best reference genome of all, the genome of the strain S28HC. That was the first eukaryotic genome fully sequenced back in 1996. It's a haploid genome, 16 chromosome, 12 megabase. I suppose you know this. So because we have a single reference genome, actually there are many regions that are completely absent from this reference genome. And if you're interested by that, there's a nice little movie on YouTube called The Human Pangenome. You can look at that. And it's a picture taken from this movie. You see that all these purple bits here, they represent DNA regions that are absent, completely absent from the human reference genome. So it's impossible to remap them. And it's exactly the same in yeast. We have a good view of the genetic diversity at the single nucleotide level, but there are many structural variations that cannot be mapped because the regions are just absent from the reference genome. Another limitation is that not only we have a single reference genome, but it's not necessarily complete, this reference genome. In human, for instance, the first release of the complete human genome comprised 150,000 gaps that was quickly reduced to 5,000. Sorry, there's no 1,000, to 500 gaps here. And then it's just recently, July last year, that the first complete chromosome was published, very soon followed by a second one, and then by the complete genome. So we have a complete reference genome in human only for the last few months. And this is the work of the Telomere to Telomere Consortium that is headed by Karen Miga. This is Karen here. In yeast, we think we have the best reference genome of all, which is probably the case. But when you look carefully to this sequence, that was the last update of the sequence was in 2011. In fact, you see that there are only 21 telomeres. So the telomeres, as you know, they are these repetitive TG sequences that cap the chromosome ends. Because there are 16 chromosomes, there are 32 chromosome ends. And you would expect to find 32 telomeres in the reference genome, but in fact, you can find only 21 of them, which means that even the yeast genome is not complete. Another limitation is that for diploid organisms, so diploid organisms, they come from two different parents, so they have two copies of each chromosomes, of course. But when you sequence and assemble a genome, what you do you generate a collapsed assembly, which is a sort of patchwork of the two haplotypes coming from the two parents. And so you're losing a lot of information by using these collapsed assemblies and not having access to both haplotypes. Even more, in yeast, we don't have only diploid genomes, but we have more complex genome contents like triploids and tetraploids. There are something like 15% of the isolates are triploids or tetraploids, so it's an important contribution to the genomic diversity. And we don't have access to these genomes. And also, there's a combination of limitation here because you see that with increasing ploidy, there is increasing heterozygosity as well. So by using collapsed assembly, you lose even more information for polyploid genomes. Okay, so this is the state of the art, I would say. And so having these limitations in mind, we decided with, so Gianni Litti in Nice, Gianni is here, and Joseph Schacherer in Strasbourg, two friends and colleagues in France, to launch this Phenovar project. So this was already a few years ago because it took us some time to do that. The idea was to try to assemble a panel of yeast strains in order to represent the complete genomic diversity in Cerevisiae, in the population of Cerevisiae. So we picked strains that covered different ploidies, haploid, diploid, triploid, tetraploids. We also picked strains that are aneuploids. We chose homozygotes and heterozygote strains, and also we made sure to sample different ecological niches, domesticated, clinical, wild, and some strains we don't know where they come from, as well as different geographical origins. And then we did Oxford Nanopore sequencing to these strains. So this is a technology that allows you to generate long-read sequences and single molecules. So there's no PCR amplification. There is no polymerization of DNA. So there's no theoretical limit to the size of the reads you can get from that. And this is a very important technological step forward, I would say, because now with this kind of long reads, you can easily assemble de novo complete genomes. Before that, it was very difficult to have a completely assembled genome, but now things have changed thanks to this technology or to PacBio technology, which is another one. So what we did, that's the methodological pipeline. I will not give you any detail about that, but we picked 99 strains and we Oxford Nanopore sequenced them, and we also did Illumina sequencing. And then we assembled de novo their genomes along with 18 sequences from 18 strains for which the nanopore sequences were available. And then we did scaffolding to all of that, and we also included the 23 complete genomes that are available publicly. And then we had the reference genome, and we annotated all the genomes with the same pipeline. So we have a panel now of 141 genome assemblies that we would like to be at the same quality as the reference genome. So let's have a look to these genomes. If we look at the number of scaffold per strain, so how contiguous the genomes are assembled, you see that 128 of them are assembled in 16 chromosomes, which is completely assembled. 12 of them have 17 scaffold, and they are broken at the rDNA locus, and one has 18 scaffold. So they are highly contiguous. Are they complete? So to look at completeness, you can look at the number of telomeres you get. So did you sequence all these chromosomes from telomere to telomere? So you would expect, if it's the case, you expect 32 telomeres. So you see that most of the Phenovar strains we sequence are 32 telomeres. So the reference genome is here. It's the purple here. I don't know if you see it. It's 21 telomere. The vast majority of what we sequence and assemble is more complete than the actual reference genome. Some are not so complete, and they correspond to the one we reassemble from public data, or also the public assemblies are not necessarily complete. And the number of telomeres is not the only metric you can look at. You can look also at the length of the telomeres. So to do that, we developed a program. So it's available here if you're interested. It's a program that just finds the location and identify the size of the telomeric repeats at each chromosomal end. And it's based on two simple metrics, the DNA entropy and the proportion of dinucleotides. And when these two metrics cross a threshold, it defines telomeres. So if you use this, you can measure the telomere size for each chromosomal end, and this is the mean telomere length per strain. And you see that for the Phe-Novar strains, we have a median telomere length that is a little bit above 300 base pair, which is exactly what is expected from the experiments running southern blot to estimate the size of the telomeres. But for the other assemblies, including the reference genome, the length of the telomere is shorter, meaning that probably these genomes, they were not sequenced till the end. We also found interesting observation that we don't understand at the moment. We don't see any difference in the telomere length between haploid and diploids, but we do see a trend like if the polyploids would have longer telomeres. But we don't know why or how, but this has to be confirmed. Okay, so this was to show you that the idea here is to move the field from a single reference genome to a panel of 141 reference genome. And we are close to that now, we think, we hope. And what can we do with these 141 reference genomes that we couldn't do before with a single reference genome? So what we can do is we can look for structural variations, of course. So there are different types of structural variation. Some are balanced. They are copy number neutral. They don't change the quantity of DNA in the cell. These are inversions and translocation, fusion, fission. And some are copy number variable, like duplication, deletions, insertions. So most tools that were developed so far, they use read alignments. You align the reads to a reference genome to try to identify these variations. Because now we have 141 completely assembled genome, we can use another technology, which is to align the complete genome one to another. And so we developed a tool called Mamanco to do that. So it's based on NUCMAR alignments, and using both local and global alignment, properties of the alignment to make categories and to identify the different types of structural variation, including insertion, deletion, duplication, inversion, and translocation. So how does it compare with the other tools that do whole genome alignments? It compares well. It does as good as the best one, and sometimes is even the only one to be able to detect inversion, as you can see here. So, and this was done on different genomes and on simulations. I'm not giving you too much detail. We can talk about that later. So what we did is to use Mamanco on the 141 genomes, and we were able to identify a bit more than 80,000 SVs. We could validate 79,600 of them. I can explain this if you want the details. And we could boil down this to a non-redundant set of 5,645 non-redundant SVs. So these are all different ones, right? So, and this is how they split. Most of them are insertions. So these would be completely impossible to find using a single reference genome, for instance. Duplication and deletions contribute for a large part, and only about 4% are balanced rearrangements like translocations and inversions. And so we have about 230, on average 230 SV per strain, which gives a distribution of like one structural variation every 50 kb. If you compare this with human, the last estimate in human was like about 25,000 SVs in the human genome, in the human population, and it's about 1 SV every 128 kb. So I'm not sure we can really compare, because now we have this number, but we had to assemble a panel of reference genome to be able to do that. So I don't know what would be this number if there was the same panel for the human population. What we can do also is to look whether it was a good idea or not to do long read sequencing. So if we because we sequence both with Illumina short read and Nanopore long reads, we can compare how many SV we would have detected if we would have done only Illumina short read sequencing. And the result is, we would have found only 24% of the SVs that we detected using long read. So really, we think it's really bringing a lot to use long read and to make a de novo assembly for this question. Okay, so all that is quite new. We still have a lot to do, but we made some observation, like nothing very surprising here, but there's an enrichment of structural variation in subtelomeric regions. So this shows you the chromosomal repartition of structural variations with here the telomeres, and here the more internal part of the chromosome. And you see that there's an enrichment for all types of SVs, deletion, duplication, insertion, and inversion near the end of the chromosomes. We also see clearly the impact of transposable elements. So if you split the insertion into two categories, the one where the DNA that is inserted is not repeated in the genome, and the ones for which the inserted DNA is repeated, you clearly see this peak here that corresponds to TY elements. The same for deletions. You really see the impact of TYs here. For inversion, we have to work a little bit more on that, but again, we have a peak at this category that could correspond possibly to inversion of transposable elements. And if you look at the junctions, you see that most inversions have their junction very close to LTR, long terminal repeats from transposable element, which again shows the involvement of transposable element to the dynamics of the chromosomal structures. Have we sampled enough? So this is where we are. So by using 140 strains, we identified 5,600 structural variation. If we do a simulation, we could predict that this should plateau at about 7,000 different structural variation, and would need to sequence probably 250 strains to completely saturate the catalog of structural variation. So we're not yet there, but I think we did improve our understanding of the quantitative impact of structural variation into the genetic diversity of the species. Okay. Another limitation that can be maybe overcome by long read assemblies is this problem of haplotype phasing. So as I told you, diploids are made of two parental genomes, and what we do a collapsed assembly, which is a patchwork of the two parental chromosomes. So what we did in the lab, we generated a hybrid between two strains of Cerevisiae that differ by 0.5%. This is a North American strain, and this one is a West African strain. And we nanopore sequenced the parental genome, and we did the de novo assembly of the haploid genomes. Okay, and then we generate the diploid in the lab and generate the collapsed assembly. And then if you remap the collapsed assembly to the parental genomes, you see that this collapsed assembly is matching alternatively with the two parental genomes, depending on which allele was chosen in the collapsed assembly. So what we did, we used this collapsed assembly to define a pipeline to generate phased assemblies. So the way it works, we generate the collapsed assembly. We align both the short reads and the long reads to the collapsed assembly. And then we try to phase the variance in the in the short reads and to phase the long reads into two different sets of reads corresponding to the two haplotypes. And then we make independent de novo assemblies of the two haplotypes using these two sets of reads. And if we follow the previous example, now if you look at the phased assembly, we have two phased assembly. That's chromosome 5, it's just an example. And this phased assembly only match with the parental West African strain and not at all with the North American strain. And the second assembly only match with the North American strain. So I think this demonstrates that it's possible to phase completely the two parental subgenomes in diploids. So we did that for the 21 diploid heterozygous genomes that we have in our data set. We found that more than 99% of the heterozygous SNPs were phased in our phased assembly. And even more interesting, if we look at the number of structural variations that we are able to detect in collapsed assembly as compared to phased assembly, you see that for all the strains using the phased genomes allow us to detect about 100 more structural variation per genome. So really, by using collapsed assembly, we lose information both in terms of single nucleotide variants, but also in terms of structural variations. Okay, so that's the conclusion for this part. The idea is to try to move the field from the single genome to the use of a reference assembly panel, and this is providing us with a new data set that is full of information, and we're just starting to look at the information that is hidden in this data set, but I guess it would be interesting for many people to have access to that in the future. One question that can be now asked is, now that we have a better description of the impact of structural variations in genome, what is the phenotypic impact of these variants? So that's a difficult question. So we developed a CRISPR-Cas9 genome engineering method to generate in the lab structural chromosomal rearrangements at the base pair resolution to be able to disentangle the phenotypic impact of structural variation from the impact of single nucleotide variants, because when you compare two strains, they differ not only by structural variation, but also by all the SNPs that are different between the two strains. So the idea is to be able to redo a rearrangement in a controlled genetic background, a rearrangement that was observed in a different strain. So to do that, we use a plasmid that encodes the Cas9 and the guide RNA. So we have a cloning site with a promoter for guide RNAs. We can clone in one step 2 different guide RNA. This is a very easy method. And these 2 different guide RNA, they target 2 different regions on 2 different chromosomes. So the theory is that these 2 guide RNA will drive 2 double-strand breaks, and then we provide in trans some oligonucleotides that are chimerical between the blue and the orange chromosome, and these donor DNA will force the repair in trans, generating, for instance, a chromosomal translocation or an inversion, or you can do a duplication as well if you like. So just as a proof of principle, we decided to make a translocation between chromosome 5 and 15 by targeting 2 genes that are well known and for which we can positively select the destruction of the gene. So the CAN1 gene, if it's destroyed, the strains become resistant to canavanine, and the AD2 gene, when it's disrupted, then the colony become red. So what we do, we transform the cells with only the Cas9, no guide RNA. So it's just to control that the Cas9 is not toxic to the cells. So we have very good transformation efficiency with several thousands of transformants per experiment. Now, if you add the guide RNAs without the donors, meaning that you would generate 2 double-strand break without providing DNA to repair this double-strand break, you see that all the cells die. Basically, we have less than 10 transformants per experiment. So we could calculate that this system is cutting the genome at more than 99%. And then if you provide the donor DNA to repair the double-strand breaks, you recover sometimes several hundreds of transformants, which means that in 20% of the case, the 2 double-strand breaks were repaired. Then you can look whether these transformants are red and resistant to canavanine. So this bar here shows the red transformants resistant to canavanine. So we have an efficiency of more than 95%. So I think this system works well. We can see the translocation using pulse field gel electrophoresis. And we also nanopore sequence this strain and assemble the genome. We detected the translocation in the sequence, and we, more importantly, I would say, we didn't detect any additional structural variation for this strain. We did it for several strains, and we never saw any off-target or rearrangement during this procedure. So we could sequence the junction by single sequencing and also show that the junction is really at the base pair resolution. So this providing a nice tool to be able to test the phenotypic impact of structural variation in yeast. So we applied this to a very famous phenotype. So you know that winemakers, they use sulfites in vineyards to make sure that there's no development of bacteria during wine fermentation, because this gives a bad taste to the wine. And so because they use sulfites, wine strains, they've become resistant to sulfites. And so there are wine strains that are resistant to sulfites, and they have a translocation, a chromosomal translocation between chromosome 16 and chromosome 8. And this was published a long time ago by Eladio Barrio. So, well, the idea was to use a lab strain that doesn't have the translocation, make the translocation with CRISPR-Cas9, make sure that we made exactly the right translocation, and test whether we recover the resistance to sulfite. So that's what we did. That's the wine strain with the translocation. You see it's highly resistant to sulfite, up to 8 millimolar and even more, actually. The wine strains without the translocation, they stop growing at 1.5 millimolar. And the lab strain without the translocation stops growing approximately the same, 1 to 1.5 millimolar. So it's simple. We say, well, let's do the translocation in the lab strain, and we will recover the resistance. And we saw the opposite. So we made the translocation in the lab strain, and now this strain is more sensitive to sulfite than the strains without the translocation. So it's a nice example where the exact same rearrangement in 2 different genetic backgrounds has opposite phenotypes. In one case, the translocation in the wine background provides sulfite resistance, and in the lab strains, it provides sulfite sensitivity. So went back to the original paper and realized that it was a little bit more complex than what we thought, because these wine strains with the translocation, not only they had the translocation, but they also had a triplication of the promoter of this gene, ECM34. And so the translocation brings this triplicated promoter in front of the SSU1 gene, which is a sulfite pump which encodes a protein that is a sulfide pump that pumps the sulfides out of the cell. So we decided to use CRISPR-Cas9 to introduce this triplication in this translocated strain. And by doing this, we were able to recover some resistance to sulfide, okay? But not to the level of the wine strain, which means that we understood partly the phenotype, but there are probably other variants in the wine background that contribute to the resistance of the phenotype. And this could be, for instance, single nucleotide variants, maybe in the SSU1 genes or others. We haven't mapped the rest of the phenotype. Okay, any question? No? Okay. Another thing that we could do is to try to reshuffle the genome, because instead of cloning two guides RNA that would target a specific region in two specific chromosomes, what we can do is to clone a single guide RNA, but now that targets a repeated copy in the genome. So for instance, if you target a LTR from TY3, you have 35 copies in the genome of this LTR. And depending on the sequence of the guide RNA, because these LTRs are polymorphic, the guide RNA will be identical to only part of them. So in this case, it's identical to 4 of them, and a fifth one has a single polymorphism on the side of the sequence. So we can predict that if you express the guide RNA into yeast cell, it would generate 5 double-strand breaks corresponding to these 5 sequences in 4 different chromosomes. And the other copies are not going to be used because they don't have PAM sequences, or if they do have a PAM sequences, they have too many mismatches with the guide RNA. So these additional copies, they can be used as donor DNA to repair the double-strand breaks, right? So this was a sort of a bet. What if we do that? Are we able to shuffle the genome? So we can predict if you cut these 5 regions and if you reassemble them, the combinatorics of that is not that big, and you can predict all the combinations that are possible. When you do the experiments, you actually find all the combinations that you were looking for, but you also find unpredicted karyotypes where non-targeted chromosomes get rearranged. So it's not so surprising, because when you do double-strand break repair by using a donor chromosome, if you make, at this time, if you make a crossover, then you can rearrange the donor chromosome even if it never was broken initially by the Cas9. Then we phenotyped these shuffled strains. This was done in Strasbourg in Joseph Schachter lab using these high-density colony arrays. And we could find, so in this heat map, you see that each line is an environmental growth condition, and each column is a strain. And the black ones are the predicted karyotypes, and the red one are the unpredicted karyotypes. And what we can see is there's a broad phenotypic diversity that is associated with this reshuffling of the genome. 19 strains showed variation in more than 2 conditions. We have 91 cases of fitness advantage and 48 cases of fitness defect. So what is surprising here is that we didn't disrupt any gene, or we didn't disrupt any promoter there. We just shuffled the genome using LTR as the region where to make the recombinational events. So this suggests that maybe just by changing the order of the genes along the chromosome, this would be sufficient to induce phenotypes. And so probably to reprogram a little bit the expression of the genome, we don't know yet. This is where we are at the moment. We don't have the molecular explanation to this observation. Okay, these are the conclusion. We can generate with high efficiency chromosome translocation, but we also did it with inversions. I don't show you these results on inversion today. This is a good tool to untangle the functional effect of structural variation from that of point mutations. And there is possibly a phenotypic impact just by reordering genes along chromosome, even if you don't disrupt genes or promoters. The last question I wanted to address is it making sense to shuffle the genome? Does it occur in nature? Do you have strands that would from one generation to another accumulate many structural variation, or is it just a lab game, let's say? So to do that, we use three genetic systems. One is very simple, it's the CAN1 gene. So if you have a point mutation that hit the CAN1 gene, and if this generate, say, frame shift or stop codon, this would, or even a nonsense mutation, this would generate resistance to canavanine. Then we developed a few years ago a system to monitor the formation of segmental duplication in the genome. So these are large segmental duplication, more than 100 kb. And when they occur, they regenerate a URA3 functional gene at the junction. So you can positively select the strains or the cells that have undergone the duplication by cultivating them on a medium that like uracil. And we also engineer a system to monitor the rate at which reciprocal translocation occur. Same principle, the translocation is generating a functional TRIP1 gene that can be selected positively. So what we do fluctuation assays, classical Luria-Delbrück fluctuation analysis. We micromanipulate single cells on plates, and we grow these single cells, we grow them into colonies for 5 days on non-selective synthetic media. And during this growth, mutants spontaneously occur. Then we take the cells from each of these colonies and we plate them on selective synthetic media to select for point mutation, duplication, or translocation. And we measure at which rate these mutational events occur by using a tool that we developed. So, so this is a colony, that's what we take, and then we try to look at which rate mutation occur in this colony. So this is a naive representation of the colony. All gray circles represent a wild type cell. And so during development, sometimes you have a mutation, okay? And so the yellow circle, they would represent a cell that has a single mutations. And the question that we wanted to ask is, can we detect cells that would have, say, 2 mutations that occur spontaneously at the same time? So to do that, we started with measuring rates at which large duplication, translocation, and resistance to canavanine occur. So the single events, they occur at a bit more than 10 to the minus 5 for the duplication, a bit more than 10 to the minus 8 per cell per division for the translocation, and 10 to the minus 7 for the point mutation. We also check that having the duplication doesn't change the rate at which translocation occur or resistance to canavanine and so on, all the combination of that. So these 3 mutational events are really independent from one another. And so then we can predict, because the duplication occur at this rate and the translocation occur at this rate, and because they are independent, we can predict the rate at which we should be able to see the one cell with the 2 chromosomal rearrangements. And this is less than 10 to the minus 12. That's just the product of the 2 mutation rates. That's the expected rate. And then we can make the experiments and select for both uracil and tryptophan prototrophy. And what we saw each time is that the double mutants, they are produced at a much higher frequency that is predicted from the single rates. And this suggests or shows that there is a sort of mutational burst, because double events occur at rates that are much higher than what is expected from the single mutation rates. And that's funny because 20 years ago, Jacques Nignot, French mathematician, has been always interested by this question about mutation rates. He predicted this in a very nice paper, and you can read this paper. I think it's a shadow. I don't know how to say that in English. The double mutations are suggested to occur at a frequency substantially higher, about 50 times, than the second power of the single mutation frequency. So, and this was based on a semi-quantitative analysis in E. coli. And it's funny to find that 20 years later, we see exactly the same thing in yeast. So where do these double mutants come from? So they must come from sort of mutator progenitors, right? Because if there were no mutators, they wouldn't be produced at this rate. So the question is, do they come from genetic mutators? So there are single mutations that occur spontaneously. Sometimes this point mutation or rearrangement will hit a gene involved in DNA recombination or DNA repair. This would generate a cell that is a genetic mutator that would produce mutants at a higher frequency. Okay. Another possibility is that these double mutants, they come from mutators, but that are phenotypic mutators. So these cells, they would be wild type, genetically speaking, but they would have a mutator phenotype despite their genome has no mutation. So of course we don't have access to these progenitors. What we do have access to is these double mutants. So we can take these double mutants and measure whether their mutation rate is higher because they would be generated by a genetic mutator, or if their mutation rate is wild type because they were generated by phenotypic mutators. So that's what we did. We took, for instance, these are two clones that produce spontaneously and simultaneously the duplication and the translocation, and we measure the rate at which you have resistance to cannabinoid, and you see that it's not higher than in the reference genome. So the rate at which the double mutant produce point mutation is the same as the wild type. And we did the same for mutants that produce both the duplication and point mutation in the CAN1 gene, and we measure the translocation rate, and the translocation rate in all of them is not higher than the ref, it's even a bit lower. So all the double mutants that we could isolate, none of them have a higher mutation rate, which strongly suggests that they do not result from genetic mutators, but they originate from transient phenotypic mutator cells. So the vision we have now is that during the development, when cells divide, you have accumulation of single mutants, and this will lead to the gradual change in the genetic information, as in the Darwinian view of evolution, I would say. But there's also, in population, there are also some sort of subpopulations that would be wild type, genetically wild type, but that would produce double mutant at a much higher frequency. And this would be able to generate some sort of error catastrophe in the genome. And what we're working on at the moment is why these wild type cells have a mutator phenotype, and we have some indication that this would be due to oxidation. We don't have the answer yet, but that's what we're working on. And it's interesting because these sort of more complex genotypes that would be produced by this phenotypic mutator, they can possibly give access to evolutionary innovations. Okay, I'm done. These are the people who contributed to the work. So Aubin, Sam, Nicolas, Stéphane in the lab of Joseph and Gianni with Theo, Omar, Anne, Hing and Yashing, and also Bruce Lab who gave us the Cas9 plasmid. We have a postdoc or PhD position open to work on this problem between polyploidy and heterozygosity if some of you are interested by that. Thank you very much.
Merci Jules, c'était super intéressant. vraiment impressionnant ce que vous arrivez à faire. Est-ce que vous avez des questions? Je pense que Damien, tu as déjà la main levée depuis un petit bout. Est-ce que tu veux commencer avec ta question?
C'est bon, je peux poser la question. Alors, dans la deuxième partie, c'est une question d'ordre technique là, que j'ai à propos de la deuxième partie de votre présentation.
Ouais.
Alors, vous avez deux cas de figure. Donc, dans un cas où vous donnez un ADN donneur pour diriger le sens du réarrangement.
Oui.
Et dans l'autre cas, vous ne le fournissez pas, vous reposez sur un réarrangement chromosomique en utilisant les chromosomes eux-mêmes comme ADN donneur.
Oui.
Une question que je me suis posée dès que vous avez présenté le premier cas de figure, c'est est-ce que vous avez regardé les quelques clones qui survivent dans le cas où vous mettez les guides sans fournir de donneurs?
Non, on ne les a pas regardés. On aurait dû, mais on ne les a pas regardés. En fait, on ne sait pas ce qui se passe. On peut imaginer que soit le plasmide s'est réarrangé pendant la transformation, et donc il est plus fonctionnel. Soit il y a eu, soit il n'y a pas eu de donneur pour réparer, et puis les cellules qui ont réussi à survivre, c'est celles qui ont fait du non-homologous unjoining, but unfaithful. So, on est obligé d'introduire une mutation parce que sinon on recouperait après la homologation. Mais en fait, c'est que des hypothèses parce que je ne sais pas.
Parce que dans le fond, je me demande à quelle fréquence est-ce que vous êtes capable d'obtenir spontanément là, les réarrangements désirés ou quelque chose qui ressemble au réarrangement désiré là, spontanément sans donneur. C'est un peu la question que je me pose.
Je ne sais pas, parce que le problème de ce système, c'est que ouais, non, je sais pas. En fait, ça ferait faire beaucoup de transformations, parce qu'il faudrait faire beaucoup de transformations pour avoir un nombre de clones suffisant pour pouvoir tester leur phénotype, quoi. Et on n'a pas pris le temps de faire ça, non.
Très bien, ben, merci beaucoup.
Merci, Damien. Est-ce que vous avez des questions, d'autres questions pour Jules? Johan?
Right, yes, so I had maybe two questions, if that's fine. We can start sailing. First for the first for the reference genomes that you've developed. So when you now have like 140 something reference genomes, how do you suggest you choose which reference genome you use if you isolate a strain in the wild? Would you just use all of them and check which one is best, or would you do something else?
No, that's a good question. So I think there's one additional step that we should do. We started to look at that, is that because of now we have this panel, the notion of reference genome has no sense anymore. So what we should do is to assemble all this genetic diversity into a graph. So people develop genome graphs. These are more complex objects than just a 1D reference genome, but theoretically you are able to put on this graph all the variants, both the SNPs and the SVs. And so this graph would become the reference. That would be the goal. And so you don't have any question, which genome should I use? These objects are a bit complicated to generate and also to work with, I would say, for the moment. I mean, it's just, it will be probably in the future, I'm pretty sure that this will be the new object that people will use. So for the moment, if you were like interested by one strain, and if you wanted to use one genome to be the reference, I would say take the closest phylogenetically speaking, take the closest one, because we sampled all the tree. One of them will be closer to the strains you want to. So you have your strain, you make Illumina sequencing, and then you remap on the genome that is the closest, phylogenetically closest.
you. And then just for the double mutant experiments you were doing, so you mentioned oxidative stress. Are you trying to correlate the number of double mutants to the age of the mother when she produced the cell that became the double mutant? If it's a really old mother, so it's the 40th bud or the 30th bud in succession.
No, that would be difficult to do experimentally, I would say. Mutations are rare, so you need large populations. So it could be complicated to do lineage tracking and then measure mutation rates. Would be nice, but well, at the moment we don't know how to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
D'autres questions? J'en ai une pour toi, Gilles. Dans la collection de souches Schauffele que vous avez créée, il y avait l'air d'avoir plus de souches qui avaient des gains de fitness que de pertes de fitness. Est-ce que c'est pas surprenant pour toi, ça? Ou est-ce qu'il y a un biais du survivant parce que les souches avec lesquelles vous travaillez, c'est celles qui sont pas trop malades, puis finalement, ce qui reste, c'est plus des gains de fitness que des pertes? Ça, il me semble la prédiction, ça devrait être plus de pertes, mais je sais pas, c'était quoi ton attente? Attendu?
Je suis d'accord. Et du coup, alors j'ai la même impression. Je trouvais ça un peu surprenant. Donc, je pense que c'est peut-être lié aux conditions environnementales qu'on a utilisées. Peut-être qu'on n'en a pas utilisé suffisamment et que notre échantillon n'est pas représentatif des effets adaptatifs que ces réarrangements provoquent. Ça, c'est une possibilité. Une autre, c'est que les mesures qui sont faites, par ces arrêts haute densité, là, je ne sais pas. Je pense qu'il faudrait, ça mériterait, on ne peut pas tout revérifier à la main, évidemment, mais ça mériterait d'être vérifié. Peut-être qu'il y a un biais. Pourtant, on a fait les expériences, on les a fait 3 fois. Chaque clone est plusieurs fois sur la boîte. Enfin, on a pris toutes les précautions qu'on pouvait. Mais je ne sais pas. Et en plus, les diminutions de fitness, elles sont liées plutôt à un nombre d'environnements qui est très faible. Donc, c'est comme si elles étaient toutes moins fit dans un très petit nombre d'environnements et que dans tous les autres environnements, en fait, on n'a que des gains de fitness. Donc, je ne sais pas. C'est vrai que c'est un peu perturbant, quoi. C'est un peu dérangeant, je suis d'accord.
Je pense que je ne doutais pas de la qualité des données, mais je me demande, c'est sûr, quand tu fais l'expérience, ce qui survit après que tu peux récolter, c'est des souches qui n'ont pas trop perdu de fitness de façon globale. Fait que peut-être ça en soi, ça modifie la distribution d'effets sur le fitness.
Ouais, mais il n'y a pas eu de sélection. Hein. Si tu veux, elles n'ont jamais vu de conditions particulières. Elles sont restées sur du YPD jusqu'au moment où on les a mis sur cette boîte. Donc,
ouais, non, c'est ça, mais ce que je veux dire, c'est que les mutations qui seraient délétères dans tous les environnements, par exemple, ben, ils ont disparu parce que ces souches-là, elles n'ont pas poussé sur YPD, puis vous ne les avez pas conservées par la suite. C'est peut-être une possibilité, je ne sais pas. Ouais.
Ouais.
En tout cas, c'est intéressant qu'il y en ait autant de mutants qui aient un avantage de croissance. Moi, j'aurais prédit 0%, la majorité des avantages, je trouve ça intéressant.
Alors, si on voit les choses du bon côté, on peut se dire si on voit les choses du bon côté, on peut se dire que, en fait, on vit sur une vision, c'est un peu malgré nous, mais on vit sur une vision que la mutation, c'est mauvais. Et la mutation, c'est je change une base par une autre et je mets un codon stop dans un gène qui code pour une protéine. On n'y peut rien, c'est comme ça qu'on voit les mutations. Là, on parle de mutations qui sont complètement différentes. On n'affecte pas les gènes, on n'affecte pas les promoteurs, d'accord ? On fait quelque chose d'autre. Donc, est-ce que parce qu'on fait quelque chose d'autre, on voit quelque chose d'autre ? Ça, c'est la vision optimiste. Encore faudrait-il le démontrer, quoi. Mais...
Super. Mathieu, est-ce que tu as une question?
Oui, j'aurais une question. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
OK. C'est par rapport à la première partie du talk que j'ai trouvé très intéressant à propos du réassemblage des haplotypes phasés. Donc, ça vous permet de détecter plus de variants structurels. Puis je me demandais, est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y aurait un biais dans le type de variants structurels que vous pouvez récupérer grâce à cette approche-là? Autrement dit, est-ce que ça serait plus facile de détecter des courts indels ou des longs indels par rapport à des translocations? Si on parle par exemple de variants structuraux qui sont hétérozygotes à l'intérieur d'un même échantillon.
Oui. Je ne crois pas qu'on ait regardé ça. Je ne sais pas. Oui, mais c'est une bonne question. On va regarder ça. Quelle est la répartition des différents types de variants structuraux parmi ceux qu'on regagne? Je ne crois pas qu'on ait fait ça encore, mais c'est une bonne question. Pourquoi est-ce que tu penses que tu as quelque chose derrière la tête
En fait, pas rien de spécifique. On s'intéresse beaucoup aux hybrides, donc je m'interroge toujours à savoir qu'est-ce qui se passe avec la variation structurelle qui pourrait être potentiellement hétérozygote. Mais je n'ai pas d'hypothèse spécifique par rapport à ça. Je m'attendrais peut-être à ce que des variants plus complexes soient difficiles à récupérer, mais...
Ouais. Lesquels sont choisis par l'assemblage qui fait le premier assemblage collapsé là, ça, je ne sais pas quel est le biais. S'il y a un biais, je sais pas. Mais on peut vérifier ça. Et ce que j'ai oublié de dire aussi, c'est que pour l'instant, le pipeline de phasage des haplotypes que j'ai présenté, celui-ci il ne marche que pour les diploïdes. Mais dans notre dataset, on a des triploïdes et des tétraploïdes. Et en fait, chez Joseph Schacherer, il y a Omar Aboussada qui a développé un programme qui vient d'être publié qui s'appelle N-Phase et qui va permettre de faire la même chose, de phaser les triploïdes et les tétraploïdes. Mais là, la complexité, c'est beaucoup plus complexe. C'est beaucoup plus complexe en fait de réussir à phaser les haplotypes chez les polyploïdes. Donc les données, le gain qu'on va avoir en utilisant N-Phase sur les triploïdes et tétraploïdes n'est pas dans mon topo encore, et pas dans mon talk, parce qu'on ne l'a pas encore fait.
C'est super intéressant. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Oui, vas-y, Claire. Je vais prendre une dernière question de Claire, puis ensuite, on va laisser une pause à Gilles, puis les gens qui veulent rester discuter avec lui, on restera ici dans la session Zoom. Puis on rencontrera Gilles pour parler plus en détail, si vous voulez. Vas-y, Claire.
Bah, c'est une question un peu technique, donc c'est pareil, si tu veux, je peux rester un peu plus après. Je sais pas si...
Ben, si tu peux rester, on peut faire ça. Je vais laisser les gens partir, ceux qui se sentent peut-être mal à l'aise de partir pendant la période des questions. Ben, je remercie Gilles formellement. Merci beaucoup, Gilles, pour ta super présentation. Merci à tous ceux qui sont venus. Puis, c'est ça, il y a des gens de mon labo, puis Claire, tu as juste à te joindre à nous, là, qui vont rencontrer Gilles dans quelques minutes. Mais disons, on prend une pause de 10 minutes, Gilles, pour te laisser.
Ouais, carrément.
OK, puis on se rejoint dans 10 minutes pour continuer à discuter.
Ça marche. Merci à tous.
Bon. Merci tout le monde.